Welcome back to another deep dive. Last time we started exploring Professor Terrecuso's essay on science and religion, right?
That's right, the controversial relationship between science and religion.
Yeah, exactly. It was published in a high school magazine called Quaderni del Brunelleschi, the magazine of a high school.
Near Naples?
Yeah, in Italy.
Yeah.
And yeah, we talked about that introduction, first chapter, and kind of set the stage for
this complex relationship between science and religion.
Exactly. So today we're diving into chapter 2, Between Questions and Mysteries. And wow, he starts off with a huge question.
He really does.
Does it even make sense to talk about God anymore?
It's a question a lot of us are thinking about these days.
Especially now with, so many scientific advancements and all the technology and everything.
It feels like science can explain everything.
Right. But then Terrecuso uses a scientific concept to frame this discussion about God.
Oh.
Yeah. The second law of thermodynamics.
Okay.
I know it sounds intimidating, but
it's really fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
So the second law of thermodynamics is all about entropy. Yeah, it basically means the universe tends towards disorder over time.
Okay. So, can you give us a way to picture that?
Sure. So imagine you have a perfectly organized room. Everything's in its place, spotless and tidy. But if you just leave it alone, what happens?
It gets messy.
Exactly. Dust settles, clothes pile up, things get scattered. It naturally drifts towards disarray.
So that's like entropy.
Entropy in action. The universe is kind of like that too. It tends to get more disorganized over time. That's basically what the second law of thermodynamics says. Entropy or disorder always increases.
So things break down, fall apart, get less structured.
Precisely. And this applies not just to our rooms, but to the entire universe, even leading to the idea of the heat death of the universe, everything eventually just kind of fizzling out.
Whoa. Okay, that is kind of depressing.
It can be. Makes you wonder what's the point of it all, right? And that brings us back to Terrecuso's question. Does talking about God even make sense when faced with this idea of inevitable cosmic decline, especially with all these scientific explanations we have now?
Right, because the science is supposed to have all the answers, right? But then you get to the origin of life itself and things get even more complicated.
Yeah, like with the primordial soup theory, which is the idea that life emerged from a bunch of chemicals in a prehistoric puddle billions of years ago.
Right, I've heard about that. But even the essay and the podcast we're referencing, they both point out how crazy complex even the simplest life forms actually are.
Absolutely. Think about proteins, for example. Those are essential building blocks for all living things. And just trying to create a simple protein in a lab, even with all our technology, is super difficult.
So you're telling me those tiny things are complicated to make?
Very. It's like trying to build a crazy complicated Lego structure just by randomly shaking a box of Legos. The chances of it happening are basically zero.
Okay, I get it. So those chemicals randomly forming into proteins, especially in water, that's basically impossible.
Yeah, the odds are astronomically small. And Terrecuso points out that water actually breaks down complex molecules, which makes it even harder to explain how those building blocks of life could have formed in the first place.
Okay, so the primordial soup is looking kind of murky now. So then, how did all the incredible variety and complexity of life on Earth come from, well, not life?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it gets even more mind-blowing when you consider DNA, the instruction manual for building a whole organism.
Oh, right, the code of life.
Yeah.
But where did that code even come from?
Exactly. It's like finding an incredibly complex computer program, but with no sign of the programmer.
That is wild. And doesn't DNA need proteins to work? And proteins are built using instructions from DNA. So which one came first?
It's a real chicken and egg situation. It's hard to explain using just material stuff like chemicals and reactions.
I see what you mean. Makes you think there might be more to the story. And the essay even talks about Francis Crick, one of the guys who discovered the structure of DNA. You'd think he'd be all about a purely scientific explanation for life, right?
You'd think so. Crick was an atheist, but even he found it hard to believe that DNA arose by pure chance. He actually suggested that maybe life on Earth came from intelligent beings from another planet, like aliens seeding life here.
Wow. So even a super smart scientist who didn't believe in God had to consider other possibilities when faced with how complex DNA is.
Right. And all this just shows that the deeper we dive into science, the more questions pop up, the more we realize we don't know.
So it's not like science is disproving God. It's more like it's leading to even bigger questions.
Exactly. And those questions can push us to think about the universe and our place in it in totally new ways. But before we get too philosophical, there's another layer we need to explore.
Okay, hit me. What else is there?
Well, we've been talking about molecules, proteins, DNA, all this microscopic stuff. But now, let's zoom out and think about the whole process of human development. How we go from a single cell to a whole person.
Right, that's incredible too. It's like magic, almost. But way more complicated, obviously.
Definitely more complicated than magic. But we can save that for next time.
Sounds good. I need a little break after all this mind-bending stuff.
So picking up where we left off, we've explored those tiny building blocks of life.
Like proteins and DNA and all that.
Right, the microscopic level. But now let's shift gears and think about human development. That incredible process of going from a single fertilized egg to a fully formed person.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-boggling when you really think about it.
It really is. And Terrecuso does a great job of capturing just how amazing this process is, especially when you consider the development of specific organs like the heart, constantly pumping to keep us alive.
It's a miracle we even work at all with all those moving parts.
Exactly. And then there's the brain. Terrecuso actually calls it the most complex machine in the universe.
Whoa, that's a bold statement. But I guess it's kind of true when you think about all the things our brains can do.
It's incredible. This network of billions of neurons capable of thought, emotion, creativity, all stemming from that initial blueprint in our DNA.
It's almost like too much to believe that it all just happened by chance, you know?
That's the big question, right? Does this level of complexity point towards some kind of intelligent design? Or is it just like the outcome of an extremely unlikely series of events?
So we've covered a lot of ground in this chapter. We started with the second law of thermodynamics and that whole idea of entropy.
Then we delved into the mind-blowing complexity of proteins and DNA, which kind of makes the idea of purely random origins of life seem less likely.
And now we've touched upon the amazing process of human development.
All of this circling around that central question. Does it still make sense to talk about God today?
And Terrecuso leaves us with a lot to think about.
Before we move on, though, there's one more important point from this chapter I'd like to touch upon.
Sure, go for it.
It's this idea that as science progresses, the mysteries surrounding life's origin and development don't necessarily disappear. In fact, sometimes it feels like the more we learn, the more questions we have.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive, right? You'd think with all this new scientific knowledge, we'd be solving all the mysteries.
But often it's quite the opposite. As we understand how things work on a deeper level, we start to see even more complexity, things we never even considered before.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, only to find more layers underneath.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the central question of the chapter. If the universe and life itself are so incredibly complex that it suggests more than just random chance at play.
Then what does that mean for how we view ourselves and our place in the cosmos?
That's a really profound question, and I think it's one that each of us needs to grapple with individually.
Drawing on our own experiences, beliefs, and of course the evidence presented by science.
It's a question that's been pondered by philosophers and theologians for centuries.
And it continues to be relevant today.
Mm-hmm.
And while there might not be one universally accepted answer,
I think the process of engaging with this question can be really enriching in itself.
it forces us to move beyond those simplistic explanations and embrace the mystery.
And to keep seeking a deeper understanding even when faced with uncertainty.
Which is, in essence, the very heart of scientific inquiry, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And maybe, just maybe, it's also the heart of a meaningful spiritual journey.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into between questions and mysteries, I'm left with, honestly, a sense of awe and a ton of new questions, of course.
All those mysteries we talked about, from the second law of thermodynamics to the incredible complexity of life, they've really opened up a whole new way of looking at things.
And I think that's a good place to leave it for today. We've covered a lot of ground, explored some really mind-bending concepts, and hopefully sparked some good conversations along the way.
Definitely. And I think that's what this is all about. Asking those big questions, pushing the boundaries of our understanding, and never losing that sense of wonder and curiosity about the world around us.
Absolutely. So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those minds open to new possibilities. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into Professor Terrecuso's fascinating essay. Until then, happy exploring.